Hello, this is Taylor Elwood with the Men's Mysteries, and today I am thrilled to welcome onto the show Mike Gathers. Welcome, Mike. Tell us who
Thank you.
you are and a little bit about you and where we can find you, and then we'll get into the interview here.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. My Mike Gathers. I currently live in Golden, Colorado, which I've been here for over 25 years. I have a wife. We're hitting our 30-year anniversary. I have two teenage sons, or I guess 18 and soon to be 21 now. And I've had a career in engineering, in psychotherapy. Now I coach STEM professionals, engineers, and entrepreneurship with a recent passion in empowering women in entrepreneurship. But I guess that's the quick rundown. I'm also kind of correspondent to maybe your other channel on magic, very much into Robert Anton Wilson. I have a podcast with his publisher and have helped put together some books for his publisher. So that's the gist of it.
Okay, and we both have a background in men's work as well. Um,
Right. Yeah, there's that too.
so there's that as well. So tell us a little bit about your journey into men's work and and what your experiences are, because what we're going to explore today is that intersection between that and the esoteric practices and belief, and stuff like associated with Robert Anton Wilson's Eighth Circuit model and things along those lines. So, tell us a little bit about your journey into men's work, and I'll speak to that as well.
Yeah, so well, I guess that goes back into what I'll just call work, in that when I changed careers from engineering to psychotherapy, I enrolled in a school, a graduate school for counseling psychology that is very much experiential learning, a little Buddhist-inspired university north of me in Boulder, Colorado, called Naropa University. And in a sense, every class was group therapy, and it, in various degrees, but it was very much about doing the therapy with each other, sort of in that container, and getting that deep experience. And a lot of the training I did in Hakomi therapy, Gestalt therapy, was very much along similar lines, doing the work. And well, I guess what I would say there, I wasn't necessarily at times I was like the token heterosexual male in the group. Um, or definitely moved from the engineering world that's largely male to the psychotherapy world that's largely female. And at some point after I graduated, I guess I started sitting in men's circles, and and the honest truth is that just being in a circle of men allowed me to relax and go deeper, because there wasn't this vulnerability with females and just kind of that to cloud the work, so to speak. And so that's where I really learned to appreciate men's work as an area to do deep work, that I was able to just relax and go deeper. So I started sitting in a few circles in Boulder, a few circles with the Mankind Project here locally in Golden. And then I took an online course with a coach that was doing a school for men, Michael Herstosky, very talented coach, and was blown away by how deep we were able to go online in group calls. And then we had a retreat at the end of what I believe was a 12-week group thing, and it was very powerful. And that really introduced me to the world of deep, deep, deep men's work, and led me to the Mankind Project, which I was part of for a good 7 years. Eventually, just I went pretty deep in the Mankind Project, but I came to some differences with the project and walked away about a year ago. And I've started engaging a little here locally with Uncivilized, Man Uncivilized. And so that's kind of my journey with men's work there.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. So on the men's mysteries, that's one of the things that we explore in general. For people there, we have a couple people who are live with us. So as you're listening to us talk, if you have questions or comments, feel free to drop those in. I always like to make this interactive with the audience as well as with, of course, my guest. And like you, Mike, I've kind of explored different shades of men's work. So I got involved with the Mankind Project initially, and then I got involved with Uncivilized and Sacred Sons, and a couple of other Kinhood and a couple of other tertiary organizations, and continue to explore and dip into different shades of men's work. I find it fascinating in general, and I think what fascinates me is that there is like this intersection between men's work itself, psychology, but then there's also this intersection with esoteric practices, under at least in certain. And so, many years before I ever got involved into men's work, I did read the Eighth Circuit Model by Robert Anton Wilson, and I found it to be and then I also read his book Quantum Psychology, and I found it to be a fascinating book because he was essentially trying to map out human consciousness, both in relationship to the body, but also cultural and societal norms and things along those lines. At least that's my interpretation of it. So what I would like was, so I'd be curious, what's your interpretation of the Eighth Circuit model? Do you feel like that's accurate? Would you agree or disagree with that? What's your perspective on that one?
Well, I love the idea that everybody can come to their own version of the Eighth Circuit model. Um, and I feel like I've worked, that's really one of my main attractions when I discovered Robert Anton Wilson was that model, and something that as I started to dip into psychotherapy schooling and practice, I really always held with me. And the way I've come to understand it is as such that, we start out as a single celled organism at conception, and as our nervous system and brain develops and grows, particularly from about the third trimester in the womb to about 3 or 4 years old, and then again during adolescence, we're taking on an epigenetic imprint from our environment. So we have our genes, but then the genes take an imprint from the environment that sort of locks genes on and off. And when you take a look at certain stages of development, which I refer to as the infant, the toddler, the preschooler, and the adolescent, um, there's certain imprints that take place during that time based on the experience. So, for example, the infant, really it starts in the womb, but let's just imagine a baby infant. A baby infant just wants to be held and loved so that it can feel safe. And so your interactions with the world as an infant, how do you reach out and ask for, being held and loved, and how do you receive that, and what's it like? That kind of shape, and that state of being when you're an infant shapes a state of consciousness, like the infant inside of you, and is always running. You have an infant that's always looking, how can it be secure? You have a toddler that's always looking to separate from the mother and sort of establish a sense of self. You have a preschooler that's learning to manipulate fine motor skills and to speak, and is kind of creating this conceptual universe, and how much can I do in the world? How well can I do it? And then an adolescent, which is like moving from this codependent relationship with its family of origin to maybe a more mutually interdependent relationship with a romantic partner, and stepping out in the village. And so these four states of development create four states of consciousness, which to me are just always running in the background and shaping our behavior. And if you look at that, to me, that's almost like the soul, like what we're born into this world with, in a way, or developed into this world with, let's say. And then there's four upper circuits that, the way I look at it, correspond to the four lower circuits. They're like spiritual emergent circuits that spring out of the lower circuits. So, for example, first circuit security leads to a sense of physical bliss and euphoria, which you might experience if through smoking cannabis or using cannabis or a yoga practice, kind of can create this physical sense of safety and bliss. Maybe just being held by a loved one can create that safety that leads to a blissful experience, and so on down the line. The kind of the toddler experience of setting boundaries with the parent and creating a vague sense of self and the emotions that transpire on those boundaries. Um, when you have kind of a more secure sense of self built, you can, and a more emotional regulation, then you can experience deeper intuitions, maybe what you might call different. I always forget to kind of struggle with the terms, but like clairvoyance, clairaudience, kind of deeper. What used to be called ESP in the 70s, that my mom was fond of, but extrasensory perceptions. You sort of
Psychic
deeper touch.
abilities.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Deeper connection with your nervous system leads to deeper sensory perceptions. Likewise, as your conceptual intelligence develops, that can lead to kind of a sense of archetypal intelligence and the sense of unity and one with the world. And as your role in the village deepens, you can experience experiences that transcend space and time, impermanence, and things like that. Um, and I think from there, then these two things inform each other. So my sense of physical safety informs how much bliss I can experience. An experience of bliss can inform maybe some of the gaps in my sense of safety. And well, it's very useful in psychedelic experience because the psychedelic experience can be described by these upper circuit experiences, and people are often kind of stepping into this and these experiences beyond words. They don't know how to put a framework around it. Oh, look, here's a model that kind of explains that and maybe explains how you can integrate these experiences. So I guess, well, I was going to stop there, but I will say uh, where that ties into men's work for me is in men's work, uh, popular framework, lover, warrior, magician, sovereign, or king. And what occurred to me is that the lover, warrior, magician, sovereign is the infant, toddler, preschooler, and adolescent. And so I kind of see that as equivalent. So I apply that model to the men's framework of that four archetypes.
Thank you. Yeah, I can definitely see that. We've had a few more people join us. So those of you who joined us on live, if you have questions or comments as the interview is going on, feel free to drop those in. We're always happy to incorporate your live questions into the interview. It makes it more interesting and fun. So I definitely want to welcome you to do that. One of the things that I always found, I guess, challenging with Robert Anton Wilson's take on the Eighth Circuit model was that it was very cerebral. And admittedly, part of it was he had an issue. He had some issues with his body. Like he had had a polio, and so he didn't really connect well. And then, and then, then there was also, kind of like a tendency to almost treat the body like a robot. So, how do you integrate the somatic elements into the Eighth Circuit model when it as it applies to men's work? Because that's something that I think is really needed, especially because one of the criticisms that I'll admit I have around Mankind Project is that a lot of their processes are very cerebral. It's not as in the body as I would like. So in your own approach to that, like how do you integrate the somatic elements so that we get out of our head and into our bodies?
Great question. Yeah, I would agree. Um, so Timothy Leary developed the model or created the model, and he was very out there in a way. Like if you go back and read info psychology, to me that reads like Bucky Fuller on LSD. It's just out there. And then Bob created this kind of Prometheus Rising, he wrote, and it really popularizes the model. But Bob tended to be a little disembodied. He also kind of tended to disregard emotions as just territorial grunting, and I didn't never really agree with that. And maybe a third criticism, and I love the man, I love his work, but just to kind of pick apart a few things is that he tended to draw isomorphisms where he compared this to that and this model to this model, and he tended to get a bit carried away with that, and it kind of dilutes the real impact of the model, in my opinion. But then a even more underground person, Antero Ali, came along, and he brought his experimental theater work to the model, and really that involved putting the model into practice. Like he didn't care about theory so much as results, and his theater practice was all about embodiment. So really, if you just start with Antar Ali and his books, Angel Tech, and his more recent Eighth Circuit Brain, that'll give you some practices that really start with embodiment and allowing
Also,
yourself to
I
go
was going
ahead.
to say, you know, also add just his archaeology of the soul also, because he goes into a lot of paratheater. So for those of you who aren't aware, Ontario Lee did a lot, like you mentioned, he did a lot of work with what was called paratheater. So he incorporated techniques from Alexander Laban and movement and dance into the theater work as well, which integrated a lot of somatic elements. It's really fascinating work in general.
Yeah, and I forget the name of it, but he has a more recent book that, like Archaeology of the Soul, that is a strict paratheater book, which is really his spiritual practice, which is kind of chaos magic taken to an extreme in terms of experimental theater, and that he really just gets down to brass tacks with it. And so, yeah, Antro really brought embodiment to the model. Um, and my, as I'm kind of working on a book, which I would like to think is sort of the next stage, is bringing in relationship. And that we are our personality, our sense of self, our sense of safety, all this stuff, the first, second circuit, infant and toddler, is all shaped through our relationships. And the idea that if we're hurt in relationship, we can heal in relationship, but just putting it all in a relational context. So all that said, I guess I don't necessarily use this model when I'm working with somebody or when I'm facilitating somebody in men's work, but it's always there in the back of my head. And as I'm working with someone, one of my go-to techniques is just stop, take a breath, tune into your body, and tell me what's going on. I feel some tightness in my chest. Okay, put your hand on your chest just to touch into that. And if that tightness had a voice, what would it say? Tricks like that, I guess. Everybody's got a gimmick when it comes to therapy and coaching, and that just what I ran through right there is probably my go-to gimmick. Is just tune into your body and tell me what it says.
Well,
Um,
and it's interesting because I think that for men in general, you know, one of the challenges is really getting in touch with their emotions. A lot of times because they don't even know what their emotions are, and it's not because they don't feel or anything along those lines. Like anyone who thinks like a man doesn't feel, it's not the case at all. It's usually a lot of societal and cultural baggage, and it's also that tendency of thinking, oh, I got to be in the head. So what do you experience? Like that's one of the things that I like to go to. It's a similar thing. Like what's the experience that you're having? Because the experience, they're having an experience. You can't get away from having experiences, and the experience is definitely going to get them out of the head and back into the body.
yeah, yeah, I think that's it. What is your as you tune into your body? What is your felt sense in the moment experience?
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. It's a lot of kind of cultural baggage that says men shouldn't feel, and I think the result of that is that men put a lot of action around their feelings, and a lot of that is heady thoughts and things like this, and rationalizing their experiences in their own way, and so it's like take a breath, tune into your body. What do you notice?
It also kind of goes back to that to that very essential principle of like you said, you kind of like the first circuit of being seen. You know, everybody wants to be seen, heard, right? That is basically the element at work there. So I think that's another element. So now earlier you mapped the four archetypes of, you know, warrior, sovereign, lover, magician to the first four circuits. what would we map to the additional four circuits, if anything? And how does somatic awareness tie into that mapping, if at all?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I was so Larry and Wilson conceived of the model sort of not really hierarchical, but there was a progression from 1 through 8. And Antro started tying in the lower 1 through 4 with the upper 5 through 8. And I almost take that a step further in my like the so circuits 1 through 4 are like your soul, what you're born into this world with, or how you develop into this world. And to me, the 5 spiritual experiences that are born from those lower circuit states of being, let's call it. Um, so it's hard for me to distinguish 5 from 1, so to speak, from physical security from bliss, if that makes any sense. There's just such a strong relationship to me that the spiritual experience is almost like an emergent property of the lower circuit soul state. Or so a question away, except that, I start, how can I create the stage uh, to create the container for upper circuit experiences that can inform my lower circuit states of being, if that makes any sense at all. So, how can I create room for more bliss in my life? And when I experience that bliss, do I find some limitations in my safety, and back and forth? Um, does that make sense?
I think it does. I think though, here's what kind of stands out to me about that. It's almost like in a way, this is kind of almost where the eighth circuit model doesn't work that well. I think in general, is where it's so concerned with categorization, it actually ignores that experiential aspect. Like it's like, all right, safety, and then okay, we're going to have bliss. Well, safety and bliss can actually go hand in hand. If so I think that's one of the challenges that I always find with it. It's like almost like and it's kind of why I'll admit it's kind of why I've never really applied the eighth circuit model to men's work, because of that, because I've been kind of like I learned about it a long time ago, worked with it for a while, and then I
I'm,
was
I'm
kind of
having a lot of choppiness on the stream here, and to be honest, I didn't really catch much of anything of what you just said. Um, I don't even know
okay,
if you're
well,
catching me now. I guess
seems like
what
it's
I will say is my bias tends to be focusing on the lower circuits
mhm.
and how I can expand the foundation. And I'm going to pause because you've completely frozen on me.
Okay. Welcome to the fun
I
of
don't know what to do
Substack.
here.
Yeah. Are you connecting with me now, Mike? Hey there. Welcome to the fun of Substack live, which is still definitely being worked on, I think. Mike, because I can see you kind of moving. Are you able to see me moving at all? No. Hmm. Well, that sucks. Mike, are you there? Yeah. All right. I can see you moving.
Oh, looks like maybe we reset here. I really lost everything you just said. You started saying we hit the limitations of the eighth circuit model, and then
Yeah. So kind of coming back, apologies for this for everyone who's watching, because unfortunately Substack Live is a little bit of a choppy mess at times. Um, what I was saying is that what I found with the challenges with the Eighth Circuit model was that it didn't always necessarily translate over. Like it became so focused on categorization. that it almost prevented embodiment. So how do you get around the categorization aspect? It sounds like you were kind of doing that in regards to melding the fifth and the first circuit together, for example.
Um, yeah, that's a great question because I, I see people talking about um, focusing on this first circuit experiences and third circuit experiences and things like that. And my experience in actual practice as a psychotherapist and a coach is that humans are more holistic, and that's just, it's a complicated mess. And I don't really think about, hey, let's work on the first circuit today. Um, to me, it's about when I'm working with people, when I'm doing my own work, presence, embodiment, and relationship. And what do I notice about how I'm showing up in the world, how I'm showing up in my body, how I'm showing up in relationship, and specifically that we're just a giant bundle of unconscious habits. And the more I can get to know my unconscious habits, the more I can be like, I do unconsciously, habitually. And now that I'm aware of it, I can make a different choice. Now, that choice isn't necessarily easy. If it was, you probably wouldn't be doing the weird unconscious habit in the first place. So there's usually some kind of confrontation with the self that has to happen so that you can make that choice. Like I have to deal with just the fact that, hey, like for me, I learned to go invisible at a very young age. So my tendency is invisible. I am a master PhD in invisibility. And yeah, and so that's my default in a lot of ways. And I have to say, like, okay, look, I can feel that habit coming on, or I can see that I've been engaged in that habit of not showing up with my kid today. I have an 18-year-old son, and he wants to talk and have conversation, and it's just kind of not my thing. But I can, hey, son, how was your day? It's that simple. But then really to just focus on being in relationship with listening so he feels seen, heard, and understood. Um, and in a sense, I think that, making the unconscious conscious, it's like, what are my unconscious habits? How can I really get to know them? Because the more I get to know them, the more I'll catch myself in the middle of it, and then I can jump out of the loop.
It almost are you're likely familiar with Dewey Freeman, so it kind of makes me think of attachment theory. And one of the questions that he ends up asking, which I think is at the heart of his work, but I think it can apply to this, is can I be okay? And then can
Mm,
we be okay? So like if we look at his attachment theory, he kind of has this graph of like age, 0 to 18 months is, can is essentially can I be okay, or can we be, or can the world be okay with me? And then after that it's 18 months. I think 3 years is like can I be okay? So it's almost like that along those lines, like getting into that early experience and being able to address things from that place and then being able to move upward. And I could see that that's where like the eighth circuit model could then like connect with that relationality aspect and be used because it maps to that pretty nicely when we look at it from that perspective.
yes, I love Dewey has a beautiful way of simplifying things. And so I think his work corresponds, it's all developmental psychology, which is what I use to define the lower four circuits. So the infant, is the world okay?
Right.
Because the infant doesn't really have a sense of self. It just looks to the mother and says, "Is the world? Are you okay? Is the world okay? Do I feel safe with you? Is the world okay?" The toddler, separating from the mother and creating a sense of self. The question, Dewey's question, is, "Am I okay?" And then sort of the third circuit would be, "How much can I do? How well can I do it?" And then the fourth, the adolescent, is, "Who am I?" Um, so yeah, those questions, like for Dewey, when he's working with the client, or I've trained under Dewey, so it's the same thing. It's I'm listening to my client, and they're asking these questions normally through their nonverbal expression. So I can be sitting there and I can be listening, and maybe they're just on the surface saying, "Who am I really?" Or maybe we're getting a little deeper, and they're starting to say, "Am I okay? Am I okay in this relationship with you, the therapist?" Or is the world okay? Is my container, you with you, the therapist, okay? And so when you listen for those questions, which it's always kind of the nonverbals with your client, you can kind of then respond and react in a way that lets them feel safe, lets them know they're okay, allows them to explore who they are in the world, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think, and that's kind of for me, like where I think it ultimately boils down to, can we get into our bodies and get to those early patterns, like the epigenetic aspects, but also those early behavioral patterns that we took on, and address them, and then be able to move forward from there and build and scaffold off of that into whatever personality or beingness we're going to enter into. And of course, that's kind of the challenge for men, because I think in a lot of ways, what ends up happening is men get stuck in that place where they never move beyond adolescence. They never move, or they never
Mm.
move beyond, maybe being in the baby stage or the toddler stage. And so you might have a grown ass adult and a grown ass man, and yet he, on some level, emotionally, is operating at that level, or mentally and consciously operating at that level of still being a toddler, for example. Can I be okay? Nothing wrong with that per se, other than that it hasn't been addressed. Fundamentally, there's been a rupture there. And so that's where I think then, like, we get into the somatic work where we get out of our heads back into our bodies and back into that place where we're able to connect with that younger version and bring that level of awareness so that the younger version can start to evolve.
Yeah, I would agree, and I appreciate you keeping bringing this back to the somatic because I tend to go off in my own head, um, and in theory, but to me it all starts with being in the body. So being in the body and then touching in. So that's sort of the first circuit physicality, sort of, so that you can be in your body, and then having a sense of self that allows you to feel your emotions, and that through relationship. Um, in the big picture, I feel like women culturally began this journey of empowerment with the women's liberation in the late 60s and the early 70s. And men, in a way, are still trying to catch up. And in a way, we're still in this kind of toddler phase with our dick in our hands, kind of feeling shame and not knowing how to deal with women in our lives. I mean, that's a little cynical view. I tend to be a little cynical, but I feel like we're still trying to catch up, and we're still all this red pill incel stuff just feels very much like toddlers trying to find their way to empowerment, and really just not knowing how to relate to a more mature, evolved woman. Um, that's kind of my weird theoretical view of the whole thing. But again, to me, it just so simple. Just get into your body. Maybe it starts with physical activity and exercise. It's like the number one thing you could do for your health. But then it just helps you learn and touch into your body. Take a breath, notice your body, experience that you have when you're in your body.
Yeah, get back into the body, find that experience, start to open yourself up to what that experience reveals. And it's not just going to be emotional. There's going to be other layers. I mean, I think that that's the other thing that is sometimes missed out on in the men's movement, is that there is like, it's like, oh, we'll get into your emotions. Well, yeah, we definitely need to get into our emotions, and there's a lot of other information being brought in and taken on environmentally, psychically, etc. And all of that has its own influence and shaping. And, for me, it's kind of fascinating. Like, getting back into the body is, in a very real sense, being able to take apart all of the beliefs and the programming and everything else that has been brought on in relationship to the body itself, and the ways that we hold ourselves in our body that keeps us from genuinely connecting with who we are. And so then it's like being able to deconstruct and take apart like that societal idea as to what a man is. And then being able to
Mm.
say, well, what does it mean for me to be a man? And how do I move forward in my masculinity? Because I'm always going to be a man. but be able to do it in a way where I'm aware of that and I'm not trapped in those societal programs, but instead can actually choose to create my own version of that that is an embodied, empowered way of living, and also allows me to avoid doing the very societal programming of emotionally displacing my emotions and everything else on everyone around me, because I'm hoping they'll do the emotional labor and soothe me as a toddler.
Um, Boy, a variety of things came up for me there, but I just appreciate the variety of impulses that people can experience, which made me think of Entre Ali, and he just really was super fixated with living in his body and following his impulses, so to speak. Maybe you'd call them intuitions, but he would get this sense like, oh, I've got to write a book on this. I hate writing books. It's the thing I like the most, but my calling, I can feel it in my bones, is to write this book. And so he'd just go write the book because he wanted to get that out of his system. Like that was a disturbance to his peace of mind. And he's like, I'm not going to feel peaceful until I write this book and get it out of my system. And then he'd write the book, and then the next thing would kind of bubble up. And so it's much more than emotions, I guess, is what I was playing off of there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's this whole experience of being able to take in everything around you and recognizing like, okay, there's like, as you said, like a disturbance or an impulse or an eros. I'm going to call it an eros of
Mm,
creativity in this case. Like I need to create something here because I feel that as a writer. I mean, I've written 53 books at this point. I'm continuing to write. And for me, it's always like, okay, this is the next thing I need to get out there. I need to put this out into the world because and so I don't even see it as a disturbance. I get why he might, having met him and chatted with him a bit a couple times, I definitely get that from him. But for me, it's always been kind of like, okay, I need to bring this out into the world because this is something that needs
mm.
to be mediated, and I'm the medium that it's being expressed through at this time.
Yeah, Antro, a friend of mine, the publisher at Hilaritas Press, was like, Antro's a theater guy. And what that told me, what I learned from that is that he can tend towards the dramatic. And so sometimes you have to kind of retranslate it into something that maybe hits home a little differently for me, for example, or kind of take what he says with a grain of salt. So I appreciate your kind of reframing of disturbance. Um, but yeah, so I guess I'll take a pause here. I'm not sure where to go.
Well, I think where we could go with this, and we'll kind of wrap this up here in the next few minutes, but we could go with this is like, where do you see the future of men's work going as we take, something like the Eighth Circuit model, Dewey's work, other things along those lines? Like, where does it need to go so that men can move out of that toddler phase and
Yeah,
step into mature masculinity?
in my opinion, so there's a variety of reasons I moved on from the Mankind Project. But one of the main philosophical differences I had is that MKP was born out of the 80s, as was the Eighth Circuit model in the 70s and 80s, and there's a very much a bias towards the individual. And I think when you focus on the individual, you lose sight of everything else. And so to me, it's the individual in relationship. And it's that relational piece that is missing from MKP, for example, as well as the embodiment piece. And so I talked to Dewey and I was like, hey, I was just reconnecting with him, but I mentioned that I was involved with MKP, and I had heard he was involved with some men's stuff, and he said, yeah, I'm working with Connor Beaton doing his thing, and Traver Boehm, I believe it is, who's the head of the Uncivilized group.
Right.
And I immediately knew those guys, if they're working with Dewey, if he's mentoring them, they're bringing in the relational piece. And I believe that is what's missing. That's why I've been excited to start to get involved with Uncivilized, is I can see that relational piece when I'm with the men in that group. And so that to me, it's like, what's your relationship to yourself? What's your relationship to your body? What's your relation to the feminine? What's your relationship to your mother and father, the females in your life? When you start to really engage in relationship, I've been married for 30 years. To me, marriage is a spiritual practice. It's hard, it's work. Your shit comes up in relationship and you have to deal with it. And if you want to be in a long, successful relationship, you're going to have to deal with your shit and it's going to come up. And I think really fully engaging in that, anytime you have this thought that your partner needs to change in some way, you need to stop immediately and, to the best of your abilities, unpack that projection and figure out what it is in you that needs to change. Because that's really what it's all about. Um,
Well, yeah, and
but
if you think that your partner needs to change, it's actually an unspoken agreement that you basically have right there that you're not being honest with yourself about or with them, because it's
right,
usually a response to some type of need that you have. Like, oh, and so it's a covert contract.
I would call it a third circuit projection. I'm not owning my own self concept about X, Y, and Z. I'm projecting on her. She needs to do X, Y, and Z. Reel it in. You know, what's going on with me? Why am I having these agreements? You're saying this unspoken contract. I can't change her. I can change how I show up in the world. And to the extent that I want to change her, I'm projecting something that's out of whack with me, that I'm not in touch with my own X, Y, or Z, and I got to deal with that.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I think that that kind of leads me to another interesting direction, which is morphic resonance. I don't know if you're
Mm,
familiar with that, but what was interesting is that I recently did a relational training with Sacred Sons, Vince Mataska Chasin, and one of the things that we ended up doing, which was really fascinating, was in the training was looking at how when you're facilitating one man, you actually can ultimately facilitate more than one man. Because if you're in a circle
mm,
with other men, depending on what's happening, like a man has a grief response and then other men start grieving, that actually is a relational component right there. Because what's happening is that one man's grief is actually touching on the grief that those other men have. And it doesn't have to be about the same thing. It's evoked a response and it's opened the door. And I got to experience this personally in the training because we were going through a process which was basically tombstone. You know, somebody's lying on the ground pretending to be the dead relative, the other person speaking to that dead relative, saying the things that they didn't get to say. And I was witnessing that, and then I had a grief reaction because I had not gotten the chance to say goodbye to my dad and say some things to him that I needed to say. And Vince noticed this. He's like, "Do you need to work on that right now?" Or like, you know, because he's like, he could have pulled it into, but he's like, he held off because he was trying to just demonstrate the thing. And I said, no. But then I was able to take it and bring it to the other men in my men's circle that I sit with and bring it out. And what was fascinating to me though was that it was this morphic resonance. Like one man's grief was able to help me become aware of the grief that I needed to have. And of course, there's a saying which is very simple, but I think it's apt, which is if you spot it, you got it. And yet, I think at the same time, there is that relational piece to it. Like, how do we relate through another person's experience to our own experience, and then being able to actually ping off of that and work with it and create that relationality that you're talking about and own our projections in the process.
boy, great topic. To me, what you're talking about is why I'm such a huge fan of the group container in general, and I really admire some of the more talented facilitators that can begin to see how the whole group is jiving with what one person is experiencing and facilitate the group as a whole. Um, I guess the first thing that strikes me in terms of working with that personally is to realize I think there's often a way to kind of dismiss your own experience by really kind of reflecting it back on the person that's having the group experience. So you were able to recognize your own group grief I believe, as you were in that experience. But not everybody is tuned in so well, and I think they just kind of feel a little grief and they project it right back on the person that's there. So, being able to slow the whole group down and say, everybody, take a breath and touch into your own grief right now, and really bring it so every individual brings it back to themselves. Yeah, all I could say right there, that I never thought about that as morphic resonance, but that's a great way to frame it. And to me, that's why I'm such a big fan of the group container. There was a phrase I heard somewhere in my men's work journey is like, when one man works, we all work.
Yeah, I
And
think that's accurate. And yet I love what you point out there too, which is like you don't want to take it and then just project it back. So that slowing down process, and that was actually a huge part of what the training was around was, okay, now we've recognized that we're all experiencing something here. We're going to slow down and slowly
mm,
bring it out and slowly bring that experience out so that everyone can collectively have their grief without projecting it back to the other person. And instead, and there's just this group release then. And I think this is part of where the evolution of men's work is going to necessarily need to go, because then it becomes human work. It doesn't
mm,
just become men's work. We actually evolve out of it being men's work into human work, and we're able to connect more cogently and with everyone involved, because we're not operating at different levels. Instead, we're all kind of coming and syncing up, and we're letting that group experience open and expand us into the necessary connection and relationality that all of us crave and need.
yeah, I think circling back to what you said, just simply slowing down to the extent that this involves mindfulness, to the extent that this involves consciousness, making the unconscious conscious, the simple act of slowing down is a way to get in touch, to be more mindful, to be more conscious. Uh, Simple as that. Like another, just step one, just slow down. Get into your body, slow down, notice what you're feeling, all that. Love it.
Well, Mike, I want to thank you for coming on. This has been a fascinating conversation, even with the technical difficulties of Substack Live. Where can we find you on the web, and where can we learn more about you?
I have a link tree that's probably the easiest way, but also mikegathers.com is kind of my coaching, not kind of, is my coaching website. And if you go to Hilaritas Press podcast, you'll find my Robert Anton Wilson podcast, but it's all at Linktree, which I believe my handle on Linktree is mgathers23. And yeah, thanks for having me. This was a blast.
Well, thank you for coming on, and thank you to all the people who joined us live. We appreciate it. Go ahead and make sure to subscribe and follow both of us on Substack, and we'll see you again for another episode of the Men's Mysteries down the line. Have a great day, everyone.